Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to this opening symposium related to nature of hope. My name is Saskia van Stijn. I'm the director of the International Architecture Biennale. And this is my second. And I noticed that my voice is failing a little bit because we had quite a party, a full house yesterday. Who was here yesterday? Just so we know which tone. Half. Okay, we have a beautiful program compiled of 2 parts where we'll very shortly touch upon the underlying principles of this exhibition, its parallel program, and our botanical monuments. And then we have distinguished speakers giving a keynote, a short slot of about half an hour. And then we will have our closing symposium with that's a collaborative effort with the New Institute and the Rotterdam Architecture Month, where we will try to combine all these agendas we all have. And Mr. Emmanuel Pratt, very warm welcome also to your family. Thank you for joining us and cruising the city and bringing your reflections to the podium in the second part of today. So we have about 15 minutes to present more than a year's worth of work. So we'll go very fast through the slides. This is where we are at now. I already introduced myself. And I will not really delve into the core principles, but maybe very shortly, the IABR is there to investigate the spatial ramifications of a changing climate. So what on all these scales, from the urban to the architecture to the landscape, are the consequences of the changes that we are facing? Changing fueled, of course, by the consequences of a planetary system unhinged, but mainly focusing also towards what the human consequence of all of that is. So we try to operate through multiple scales, and just wanted to highlight this X-curve by Mr. Dirk Loorbach, a transition academic, because this kind of thinking has also been informing the conversations we have had with the curators. So what you are looking at is maybe 2 centuries in the making, one system, let's call it modernity, fueled by industrial era, is in decline, yet an alternative is on the rise. One could question. So we are now in the middle of this chaotic reality where we could reformulate the answers to these multiple crises, the poly-crisis. And that's maybe also the blueprint for the curatorial team, that how to tackle all of that in a manner that works. I'm going to very shortly only mention that at the beginning of the thinking, the farmers' protests were extremely important because of the correlation between the Dutch, let's say, history of the landscape and how it has rooted our democratic principles. So this correlation in what is wrong with the land, if we can't talk about it in a way that is maybe a bit hopeful, because what we see now is that the politics of fear are being enacted to the changes we need to confront ourselves with. As said, I'll only set the stage very shortly, so moving on to introducing all the people that we have worked with, but mainly I now invite the curatorial team forward to me. Please give a very warm welcome to Janne Breistik, Hani, just it's all of you, so come on, Noortje, Katerien Koekoek, Alina. Maybe I can kick off with you, Janne. Could you sketch what are the basic principles of the thinking behind the exhibition, Nature of Hope? And you had particularly one slide that was very center stage to your thinking.
I think, yeah. So there, that's all of us. Yeah. That's me. That's the slide. Okay. So apologies for the repetition for those who heard this already yesterday, but we're talking in preparation for today. I think this is an important slide to share So this is a slide that was made by the IPCC and IPBES the first time they met in 2020 to assess how do the climate actions and the biodiversity actions of the two UN organizations actually relate to each other. So IPCC is, of course, the International Panel for Climate Change, and IPBES focuses on biodiversity, both UN organizations. And what this slide, still not very legible, says is that when we look at climate actions, there's a lot of, and the red means there's a negative impact on biodiversity actions, which you see on the right. If we narrate our actions from a biodiversity perspective, actually things are also addressing climate actions as well. And I think this has been a fundamental starting point in the development of the exhibition for us, in the way that we wanted to work. Of course, embedded in this diagram is the kind of the rootedness of when we think about objects versus when we think about ecosystems, and kind of it triggered a lot of the conversation and a lot of the thinking. And so the exhibition, in a way, is a relational map of a large collection of practices, close to, I think by now we hit 85, where we see that practices are really going beyond trying to achieve a certain sustainable standard, but rather achieving regenerative practice and achieving this ecosystem and biodiversity thinking in the relationship also to climate actions. I think maybe one other thing to add in terms of the exhibition is that we worked in 5 themes, and within these 5 themes we staged practices who were working on soil within the chapter of soil, practices which looked at infrastructure, practices that looked at shadows of materials, shadows in the landscape. Of course, in this notion of ecosystem thinking, it's very much also about when a building is produced, that we don't replace one material with a bio-based material, but still the practice is extractive, but also that we need to know where that tree comes from. We need to know who produced that tree. And so in that, there is a significant shift from how we practice architecture still today in many instances. And so this was staging some of the practices that are investing in understanding all those components of materials and the production of building. The other themes were resistance and practice and hybrid becomings, but I think the others will also talk about that as well, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I wanted to touch upon this one before I let you go, Jenna.
Yeah.
Maybe could you unpack a little bit what you consider the driving forces for the practice at the moment through the lens of this diagram?
Say that again, sorry.
I was wondering if you could underpin a few of the points here. To my understanding, one could say that the left, everybody has already acknowledged, but maybe how does it correlate to the right part of the diagram?
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I think for us in making the exhibition, it was very much also trying to tap into work that is already ongoing, trying to understand and support the thinking and the ideas that were already being in development. And what we actually saw that, and this is in a way a representation of that as well, that two things I should actually say. One, there is a widening or an expansion of the practice of architecture, that architects relate to new themes, they relate to infrastructure, they talk about policy, how policy needs to change, they talk about how legislation needs to change, but not in only a theoretical perspective, but so for example we have the project House Europe, an initiative by architects where they're part in the process of developing new legislation on a European level that would require permits for demolition. Demolition at the moment is purely a health and safety guided undertaking, not yet should this building torn down or not. Another project, Open Systems Lab, also in the show, they are working to reconfigure policy in such a way that both machine and people can read it through flowcharts, therefore allowing for flexibility and complexity, because we need to change our policies as well. With having to address all of these biodiversity and climate issues, our policies need to become more complex, need to become more precise, but we also should depend on machines to help us through that process and not simply try to keep it in the stack of books that we have. So that is one aspect. The last one, very quickly. I think what we see here is and this is the very exciting thing of working on this exhibition, on working on this effort, there is really what I think is a shared narrative emerging. That there is a bigger narrative emerging, and it's all related to our relationship to nature, our relationship to architectural practice as a community, and sharing knowledge beyond the celebration of the built object, which I think is the legacy that we're coming from.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that concise introduction. Yes, please, bring it on. She deserves it, definitely. Katrien Koekoek, I'm trying to bridge a little bit, like how do we get to the story that, or the projection that Jonna mentioned? You know, practices, many of you are here, so thank you so much that we could display your work and thinking and commitment to this. How are you facilitating that conversation in the practice place?
Yeah, so I mean, what we can hear, I think, from what Jonna is also saying, is that when we start considering nature, we start to consider all of these aspects that are discipline and that architecture and design and the built environment relates to. But that's quite a challenging task, and often I think many of us, and also in the world at large, maybe we don't know exactly yet how we can make that our main practice, or how we can make that the normality of, the norm for how we practice, right? And so we thought it was very important that also within the coming couple of months, where we have all these beautiful practices and all of the work that many of you worked on displayed in the exhibition, but that we also can make the exhibition a space of encounter, a space to organize, and a space to learn from each other. So many architects, Jonna already mentioned a few, House Europe, of course, here we also have Platform Woonopgave in Nederland, and we have many other practices as well. For instance, the Architecture Lobby will be coming in. And we thought, okay, how can we also facilitate that these people start to meet each other, and also that, for instance, within our own context in the Netherlands, people start to organize to build a regenerative architecture practice. So that's also very much a call towards all of you to join in that effort. Mm-hmm. I brought a little prop. Thank you.
Do your hand.
Not so little. It's not so little. There you go. Oops. Thanks. Thank you, Hani. So this is the calendar of the assemblies that we'll be hosting throughout the Biennale. Basically from the living ground and the soil towards bioregional building, the question of valuing nature and how can we actually develop strategies to value nature within existing policy structures, situated solidarity, how can we bring many of these practices like the botanical monuments, like the Hef Park that some of us saw this morning, how can we bring together and build alliances between a lot of these very localized efforts and these huge challenges that we're facing. What to think of the labor that we're putting in as architects? What about the office, architects unionizing also in solidarity with builders? How can we organize on that front? And how do we change the very values from which we practice as well? And how can we build a feminist practice there? Well, all of that, these will have like day-long workshops that are very much inspired by community arts, by theater, by many other disciplines. And all of that will lead up towards building a sort of multivocal new narrative for architecture that we'll be festively presenting in the closing weekend of the Biennale.
Fantastic,
thank you so much, Hani, for holding this up.
Alina, one of the things that you spoke about quite extensively was this building of relationships. And could you maybe unpack a little bit of the relationships that you have been putting extra focus on?
Yes. You mean in terms of curating?
Yes.
Yes, I think, yeah, also just to give this a super quick clarification, I kind of talked about our research kind of process yesterday, and one of the topics or one of the conversations that emerged through our research, through talking to practitioners, especially young practitioners, was how they preferred to frame their working together with other people, other types of people, other communities, as alliances, because they feel that maybe the term collaboration has been sort of like captured too much by the conventional practice, by the sort of like single project focus. And an alliance, it reports much more to, in a sense, a collective project. So, you know, a social project, a political project, and that's how they see kind of their relations with the people that they choose to work with, how they form their bonds, which are maybe kind of longer or deeper or more based in, you know, friendships, kinships than the usual sort of architect-client relationship. So kind of we have different practices that touch upon that in the exhibition. One that I think it is extremely special and deserves a lot of attention is the listening station that we have kind of on one of our walls, which is a project that comes, it's a collective project that comes from Malmberget in the north of Sweden, in the Arctic Circle in Sami territory. And basically kind of, at first we connected to Karin Reisinger, who is an architect by training, and she kind of built alliances with all of the women of Malmberget, because Malmberget is a village that is collapsing. It's being kind of eaten away by a crater that opened up there due to deep soil iron ore mining. And through these alliances, she kind of is building this archive of archival practices. So the women there, they archive kind of what they're losing and kind of the process of loss itself with, you know, they use kind of multiple different media. So they do embroideries, they do kind of like a cataloging and collection of the rubble of the buildings that are demolished. They make poems, they walk ancestral paths. Yeah, basically kind of they have this entire sort of collective action in this alliance for their traditions and their memory. And we are kind of representing, showing some of that here.
Yeah,
yes.
fantastic. Would you mind passing on to Noortje? Cheers. One round of applause, because they worked tirelessly for... Noortje, would you care to sketch out a little bit the emphasis you have been putting in, and maybe through the lens of hope, because that word I haven't heard so much.
Yeah, I think the emphasis that I've been putting in is how resistance as practice, how the architects and the architectural field, the discipline, urbanists, landscape architects, the whole shebang, let's say, how we can collectively get agency again also in our more political systemic field. So not so through architecture, how to create hopeful futures again. And what I've been really focusing on is different ways that the architect has agency, let's say. So through policy, like Jana was already saying, with Open Systems Lab and House Europe, for example, or with new alliances, but also really through more, maybe the more extreme side or more, how do you say, radical side of resistance, so really the activist side. And one project that I always really like to show as an example of that is, maybe you can go to the slide.
Sure. Which slide?
I don't know. Somewhere the XR.
The XR. Okay.
The XR.
Well, you didn't mention which one.
Yeah, sorry. So one of those is, for example, one of my favorite projects in the exhibition, or at least one that really represents that agency for me, is this. It's called The Beacon. It's designed by two activists from Extinction Rebellion UK that have a background in design and architecture, and they designed this structure based on with their architectural skills, with their knowledge of design, with the knowledge of tensegrity structures based on architectural history from like the 1960s, Cedric Price, and they use that to, in current times, design this structure that can be become an actor in climate action. So it is a light design. It can be set up, folded and set up again in 15 minutes. Police cannot get to it, so it really delays the action. So in that sense, but it's also a collectively built practice. So I think what is for me very hopeful in this resistance is that both architecture itself and the architect as an individual within this network of a collective can create this agency for a literal systemic, or a fight for systemic change.
Yeah.
And for me, that's very hopeful.
Thank you, Noortje. Please give it up.
Is this on? Is it on?
Maybe just hold it
Yeah,
for
I'll
a
just hold.
second.
Oh wait, you can hear
That's
me.
good. Okay. Last but not least, you'll also be moderating this first part.
Yes.
Hani, could you take us by the hand through one of the aspects that you found important to highlight in the exhibition or in the parallel program? Or
Yeah, I think what I would like to do is very quickly discuss the Open Systems Lab project, because that's in the exhibition space, but then also use that as a segue to talk about this event, which we'll be talking about later as well. So I think from my perspective, you've heard from all of us in different ways this kind of discussion of how the systemic is an important aspect of facilitating or making this change happen. And I think really being able to navigate systems by either sort of in the way that Open Systems Lab does it, which is looking at what I would call policy palimpsest. So on the document on the left-hand side is the first page of like a 1,200-page document, which kind of summarizes some parts of policy planning law in the UK. And these are kind of like the documents you'd have to look through to be able to understand what you can and can't do to your own house. So say if you're building an extension or if you're changing the size of windows or something. And so what Open Systems Lab have done is they've used modern technology, so through coding, through essentially coding and building a usable interface to be able to get you to move through that without having to really go through all those kind of like thousands of pages of these kind of layers of policy. And so that project, alongside what has been said already, is a really good example of how you can use the sort of critical spatial analysis or critical analysis that you develop as an architect in order to map out and understand systems. And then by doing that, it also allows you to be able to be much more precise in where and how you intervene and kind of what kind of efforts and energies are needed in that order. And so taking that on, we wanted to expand also more broadly to kind of reflect the ecosystem that we're trying to kind of embody. We wanted to reflect on moving outside of the new institute and building collaborations within local organizations. So just before you saw the Day Dependance and AFFR, those are two of many collaborations we're taking under the city. But what we're hoping to do is also, as part of the collaboration with Dependance, is to put on an event with Max Isle, who is the author of A People's Green New Deal. This event is really supposed to kind of try to get us to think more about how can we navigate policy and what measures are there. So most of you might have heard of the Green New Deal initiative, which is a lot of policies across sort of the world at the moment that have come up as a result of our reaction to kind of the urgent need for us to react to the climate change through policy. And so Max's book really looks through all of those, but then suggests a more radical alternative that actually centers people in that process. So we'll be bringing them in conversation with an architect.
fantastic. Well, we promise to keep it very, very short. A short amuse. Yeah, give it up one more time. If you're keen on learning more about these brilliant minds and what brought us to this whole endeavor, you can either visit the exhibition, which is guided weekly by a different curator and myself, or you can visit us on one of the sites where we are collaborating with multiple stakeholders in the existing fabric of the city, already doing the work of enhancing biodiversity. We have multiple programs, sound conversations. It's too much to share for now. This is what these sites look like. This we were here this morning. It was fabulous. But I would say keep an eye out on our website. Thank you for joining us. But the real deal is now starting because we have some of the practitioners giving keynote lectures about the fundament of their thinking, and they will be introduced by Hani. Have a nice afternoon.
Okay. Okay.
So one more.
So
One more microphone.
I think I'll just run through the structure of what we're hoping to do over the next hour and a half. So we're going to start with a keynote lecture by Jeremy. Jeremy Till is from the research collective MOULD. I will also give a very brief introduction, literally like hopefully just one paragraph to each of the speakers from today. And then Jeremy will also be sort of in conversation with some of the other members of MOULD who are in the audience today. And then we'll move on to have two sort of shorter presentations by the contributors on the show, so Baerbel Mueller and Pedro Aparicio, right here. And then we'll open up to sort of half an hour of conversation. So I'm just going to go through and give the quick bios of each of the speakers. So Jeremy Till is an architect, writer, and educator. He was previously the head of Central St. Martin's and the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Arts of London, as well as the university lead on the climate emergency. Jeremy is a member of research collective MOULD, and they have contributed to the show. So you'll see the sort of the diagram that's sort of become a really beautiful and intricate curtain. I'd really recommend to you engage with it and really look into it. The latest project from MOULD is Architecture as Climate, and I think that's some of the stuff that Jeremy will be talking about today. Next, we have Baerbel Mueller. Baerbel is an architect and researcher based in Austria and Ghana. Baerbel's placehold practice is strongly informed by contextual approaches, shaped by an interest in translating these into new typologies and contemporary responses. Baerbel is the Dean of and Associate Professor at the Institute of Architecture at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. And she is the founder and head of Applied Foreign Affairs, a lab which investigates spatial, environmental, and cultural phenomena in the rural and urban sub-Saharan Africa. Their work is also in the exhibition. It's the screens, the 9 screens, which, again, I'm sure you'll talk about it more in detail later. Last but not least, we have Pedro Aparicio-Llorente. He's an architect and founding member or founding principal of APLO, a practice based in Bogota that makes and researches buildings and landscapes. His work stems from 10 years of experience in design and construction within the material practices and political ecologies of post-colonial tropical habitats. Pedro holds an architectural degree from Universidad de los Andes, and an MDes Urban Landscape Ecology from Harvard University, the GSD, Graduate School of Design. Okay, without further ado, I think that gives them a quick introduction. So I'd like to welcome Jeremy to the stage.
Thank you. This feels like a responsibility, but also a joy to do this, to do a keynote as the opening thing. But I would first of all just like to really express profound thanks to Saskia, to the curators, to Jana, to Alina, I can't see you all, Catherine, Norcia, and Hani. And also, because they often work in the background, the amazing production team, Reineke, Venla, Maria, and in our... Yeah, just amazingly supportive and caring, but also quite tough. And as a kind of recovering patriarch, I should say that if this lot were running the world, we wouldn't be in the position we are. Anyway, so we were given a brief to do the intersection of systemic change, nature, ecology, and architecture in terms of their past, presents, and futures in 40 minutes, yeah? So no pressure. And when I say we, I want to make it absolutely clear, although I am standing individually, that this is a collective effort and a collective project and a collective thought. So let's start. I want to start with a kind of the violation of Nature 101, the unnatural beginnings of modernity. And just to put up some quotes, which even now when I was looking at them this morning, I just think, my God, this was actually said by men, said by the beginning of modernity, that we are going to make her your slave, to have the power to conquer and to subdue. Now, I'm not blaming Francis Bacon for the state that we're all now in, and nor am I going to blame Immanuel Kant. But what these words do, and shockingly do, is to set a sensibility which I think that we are still very much part of. And it's a sensibility of the Western Enlightenment modernity, which is still controlling the way that we operate as architects, as thinkers within the world. And in relation to nature, this beautiful quote from Ben Oenrich, I think is really important. This idea that once that state of mind of nature being our slave, of nature being a means to an end and the end is man, once that is in your head, then nature is killed. It's seen as an abstraction. It's made dead. And then we can go on making it deader. And so this state of mind then leads to actions, and these actions, again, in this incredible, and this is 1855 from a Native American chief, and this is the suffocation that we are now living with. And this comes from an attitude towards nature, which arises out of those profoundly disturbing and violent quotes which I put up at the beginning. And of course, architecture is part of that. The architecture in relation to a mode of thinking about the world which violates nature, architecture as we know it, up to now, let's say before this Biennale, is something which is very much part of this violation of the world. Unnatural architecture.
Architecture is acid mine drainage, acrylic, air pollution, aluminium, arsenic, trioxide dust, basalt, bauxite, bioprocess, biodiversity loss, black sand mining, blasting, bond aid for plastering, calcite, calcium oxide, capital, and carbon. Architecture is caustic soda, cedar wood, chromium, clay, clearances, coal, cobalt, concrete floor hardeners, copper, copper concentrates, cryolite, deforestation, depletion, desertification, dolomite, emulsion polymers, extraction, firewoods, floods, fluorides, fly ash, foamed plastic, food insecurity, granite, gravel water, groundwater, pollution or depletion, flame retardants, hauling, hemlock wood. Architecture is hydraulic excavation, land grab, large-scale disturbance of hydrogeological systems, lead, limestones, lithium, loss of landscapes, loss of vegetation cover, malachite, manganese, marble, mercury, methane, mine tailing spills, mining of silica sands, monopoly, mold-releasing agents, mud disposal areas, mud flow, nepheline, nickel, noise pollution, oak wood, oil, oil shale, oil spills, open pit mines, ore and peat. Architecture is pebbles, phenol formaldehyde resins, pine wood, platinum, polyethylene, polymer bonding agents, polypropylene, polystyrene, porous volcanic tuff, quartzite, reduced ecological and hydrological connectivity, ripping, roasting processes, rock, flowers of volcanic origin, rosewood, sand, sand sediments, sandstone, sawdust. Architecture is sealants, silica dust, soda ash, soil contamination, soil erosion, spruce wood, styrene, surface retarders, surface water pollution, tar sands, teak wood, thermal cracking, timber, tin, titanium, toxic waste dumping, trash, uranium, vanadium, waste overflow, zinc. Architecture is climate.
So when we started this project, we started with two questions. The standard question is this one. What can architecture do for the climate emergency? Architects as nice, well-meaning, liberal people attempting to single-handedly address the climate emergency. Now, there's a huge problem with this because it places architects and architecture outside of the condition of the crisis. We see ourselves as experts who come and see the crisis in front of us. We pick off the easy bits, green roofs, trees on buildings, solar panels, all that kind of stuff. And we think that by doing that, we are applying some kind of solution to the crisis. But all that is happening within that is a very partial and a very impotent patch to a much bigger wound. But we feel good about it, and we call ourselves green, and we call ourselves sustainable. But in fact, because of the partial nature of it, because of the band-aiding of it, in fact, it's incredibly vulnerable and impotent as a gesture. Mainly because we're only dealing with the symptoms. Yes, please do reduce your carbon when you're designing buildings. That's important. Please do make it as nature positive as possible. But in the end, by only dealing with the symptoms, possibly the causes of the climate breakdown, not possibly, actually, the causes of the climate breakdown are never addressed, which means that the systems that have produced it are allowed to continue unchallenged. So instead, what we did was to reverse the question. And this is a much more important question because it asks us to rethink, as this Biennale does, the discipline. It asks us to be vulnerable individually and collectively in the face of the crisis. It asks us to reconsider the systems that have supported us in the Western Enlightenment model of architecture since Francis Bacon. I will blame him. But also, it positions architecture as part of the necessity of systemic change. Because climate breakdown demands systemic change to our politics, to our ethics, to our economics, to our social relations, architecture also becomes part of that. And this isn't a despairing thing to say, it's actually a very hopeful thing to say, as we will explain. And so once we'd reversed it, then we came up with a new title for the project. It had a title before called Architecture is Climate. It entangles architecture within the conditions of climate. It doesn't place architecture outside of it, it is within it. And architecture and climate are joined by another number of very clear relationships. First of all, they are relational. Climate is not simply a technical thing, although it's often talked about like that. It's a social thing. It's an economic thing. It's a political thing. It's an ethical thing. And so is architecture. Architecture and climate are both temporal. I'll be talking about, as briefed, the past, the present, and the future of climate and architecture. That often architecture is presented at the instant of completion, emptied, with time frozen. But of course, it has a before, and the before is often violent in terms of its extraction and exploitation, and it has an after in terms of its life. So does climate. Climate has a before in terms of the way that the crisis has been produced. It has a present that we're all living in, and it has a future that we need to deal with. Architecture and climate are both determined in their current modes of thinking as conditions of modernity. Architecture and climate are both very much part of and driven by the forces of capitalism. Architecture and climate are experienced through multiple emotional, haptic, physical sensibilities, individually and collectively. And architecture and climate profoundly affect the more than human world. And therefore, by bringing them together, you can have the discussions about how these relationships can and should play out.
Imagine you're standing knee-deep in a flowing river. Let's call it the river of architecture. You are looking downstream, towards the river's floodplain. Recently, the waters in the distance have risen alarmingly, but this presents to you not an obstacle, but a stimulus to your imagination. You are an architect. It's what you do. You solve problems. You project your inner creativity onto this landscape, gathering the pure waters of past architectures to create your vision of the next. Buildings and infrastructure rise in your mind, shrugging off the floods. They are gleaming things, dams, towers, structures, channels, dikes, bridges. which will shape a brave new world. Determinedly facing forward, you are lost in this vision of the future. But then you feel something tugging at your knees. You look down and see strands of filth wrapping around your legs. Worse, your skin is getting stained. You turn the other way, and there, upstream, you see the past. In the distant hills are the sites of colonization, where man's disdain of nature and of the stewards of nature triggered the ecological collapse, the Plantationocene. Closer in are smoking chimneys, cement works, tarmac surfaces, soil grey from petrochemicals, all of which stand as witness to extractivist greed and growth. In the shadow of these carbon crime scenes are the hidden sites of production, where now forgotten labor was once sweated.
It is raining upstream, and the water running of the landscapes of the past and into the river is poisoned. It is not the pure river of architecture, but of architecture's guilt, architecture's dependency. As it flows downstream, you are distraught to see all your shining chimeras of the future stained by the residues of toxic histories, which flow irrepressibly through the present. And you recognize your impotency as your presumed solutions are revealed as no more than very partial band-aids that barely patch the underlying wounds. You start twitching, head swiveling, to look first one way and then the other. And in this repeated movement, you understand that any viable future downstream can only be found by understanding and intervening in the systems of power and capital upstream. It is lonely standing in this river, so you look sideways, and there cutting through the sediments are other rivers and multiple heads bobbing back and forth, upstream and downstream. And you find hope in this collective movement within the now, because futures are multiple and found in gaps in the present.
So I'm now going to talk about the project that you can see and take you through that, because it addresses some of these things. It addresses this idea of looking at the causes and not at the symptoms. So the diagram arose out of a commission from eFlux and the Jenks Foundation. And it is, I'll go back, let me go back. It is a diagram which is a mountain of CO2 emissions, which we then have cut through to reveal the sediments that have made that mountain grow. And the sediments are described in terms of 6 verbs, and the 6 verbs of modernity. So I'll very quickly go through these. The first is ignoring. The modern mind, in its totalizing and ordering sense, is also a mind of exclusion and of ignoring. And in that, it will ignore the consequences of its actions because it feels that its actions are necessarily right. It will ignore other ways of being and doing that fall outside of the purview and diktats of modernity, and it will ignore, in terms of climate, social justice, because climate is treated in the modern mind simply as a technocratic device. Next is the word separating. The separating of the modern mind from other ways of thinking, the separating of forms of knowledge, so that scientists can't speak to poets, anthropologists can't speak to architects, etc. Here they are going to. That these separation of forms of knowledge means the way that the world is addressed can only be addressed in particular ways. And when one form of knowledge, particularly a technocratic one, becomes dominant, then the world is only seen through one frame. Separating functions from each other, particularly if we see that in terms of design and how design too often operates. The idea of a city being divided up into someone who landscapes it, someone who urban designs it, and then someone who put buildings in. But most tragic of all, of course, is the separation of humans from nature. And as soon as that act of separation, which I introduced at the beginning, is made, then we're on a very fast track towards the catastrophe that we're now facing. Accumulating is an absolutely essential part of the modern project. Unless we are growing, it's a failure. Unfortunately, growth is too often defined in incredibly reductive terms called GDP. But this sense that the only way of progressing is through growth is played out politically, economically, and socially the whole time. And the accumulation, particularly in the state that we're in at the moment, is an accumulation of control, the kind of centralizing of control within mega corporations, mega political movements, which in their own way then exclude others through the accumulation of control. Most tragically, the accumulation of stuff. One of the absolutely terrifying graphs is a graph of GDP. I could do it your way. GDP always has to go up, right? Otherwise it's a failure. It's matched almost precisely with a graph of the growth of material extraction. Almost precisely. Look at Jason's book on degrowth to find that. And of course, an accumulation of wealth goes with that as well. The next one is exploiting. In order for these systems of growth to continue, the dark shadow of that is a set of exploitations. The exploitation of labor, which has already been talked about and was apparent within the Biennale. The exploitation of land. Tragically, the use of land simply as a commodified resource rather than an act of living soil. The exploitation of resources in terms of the endless extraction of which architecture, as a piece that Tatiana read out, is completely involved in. Band-aiding, we've already talked about. The idea of the band-aiding of the wound of climate, the wound of biological collapse, of ecological collapse, the wound of the violence of nature, and the idea that you're band-aiding it through buildings and through splitting the world up into various disciplines, and each discipline claiming that they can band-aid better than the other one. And finally, the idea of violating. So it was kind of interesting that Jana and the rest of the team put this very dark set of words as the first thing that you see. And maybe the intent was that you kind of see the dark words and you find the hope around the back of it. But the violating of boundaries, most distressingly and importantly, of planetary boundaries, the violating of identities, the suppression of other identities that don't fit into the framework, and finally, the violating of others' rights and capabilities. So those together form a set of verbs down there. Along the top are the sites of climate breakdown and of architecture, the sites where climate breakdown and architecture are joined, both in terms of the way it's experienced but also produced. And these sites, rather beautifully, map not quite directly onto the 5 themes of the Biennale, but they could have. And maybe I'll just do a little exercise where they do. But these are the sites, quite rightly, I think. So sites now, nothing to do with a topographical site or a contextual site or all that stuff that architects love doing, but actually sites where you, as all five have talked about, sites of intervention where you can use the spatial imagination and intelligence in a more productive way. Policy we've talked about quite a lot already. Resources we know about. Land, we talked about land as soil. Infrastructure is there within the Biennale. Knowledge is there within the Biennale. Culture and the necessity for us actually to have a kind of almost collective in this room cultural rewiring, an unlearning in order that we can face the future in a manner which casts off the kind of the shackles, the shadows and the suffocation of the modern project, and finally of labour. And you put all that together and one gets a kind of matrix of difficult words. The person who embroidered this piece said, when I picked it up, said, "Oh my God, Joe, I'm bloody glad to get rid of this. I'm so depressed because of having to embroider all these words in kind of 4 weeks. But we have to have hope." So the hope lies in the gaps in the present. The hope lies in these white bits, in which, in the original diagram, there's a set of aphorisms. The hope rises in the fact that it's the gaps in the present that you lever open and hopefully collapse the sediments, to find futures which are resilient, because they're not futures which have been dreamt out of an ungrounded imagination. They're not futures which are based on technological, eco-modernist invention. They're not futures which have pure flights of fancy. They're futures which are absolutely caught within the sediments and want to get rid of them. They're futures in which you are addressing the causes of the crisis in a very particular, you can't do them all, but you can actually begin to engage with them. And so on the website called architectureisclimate.net, we have the issues all there, longer explanations of it. And then we have some practices of hope. We have about 110 practices of hope, but it's important that you read the first line here. Practices is not about architecture as you know it. There are not that many buildings there, but there are few. But there are, well, let's see some of them. Just a random selection. Oh, Sweetwater Foundation. Feld, so this is another open systems one. Material futures. And each of these practices, we relate back to the issues, and then we also relate forward to the futures. So they're seen as a kind of exemplary ways of leveraging open, of finding the cracks in the present and levering them open in terms of an expanded, as Diana was talking about, an expanded version of architecture which goes beyond the formalism of the static building. And then the final bit is the futures. And the futures is a set of prompts available at a bargain price in the shop in the form of cards. And the prompts are then on the back of the blackness is a lighter piece with floating embroidery and a kind of set of prompts about how, if you're stuck, if you're feeling sad or angry, that you can use the prompts to try to maneuver your way out of that sadness, anger, and stuckness.
It is too often more expedient to forget than it is to remember. Forgetting provides a false sense of freedom in which futures are constructed unbound from the weight of the past. Architecture as a discipline and practice is guilty of such amnesia. Its self-imposed boundaries ignore what lies beyond in an attempt to better control the inside, forgetting that architecture is also relational and dependent. Only certain memories are allowed to enter, approved forms, norms, tastes, individual heroes, exemplary techniques, limited geographies, constrained definitions, dominant systems, excessive extraction, autonomy. But here, in the promise of this Biennale, different memories emerge to overcome this collective forgetting. Like archaeologists, we need to dig backwards, uncovering, filtering, exposing, and only then move forwards. In this scenario, memory is both disturbance and restitution. How can we possibly talk of equitable futures unless we remember the inequities and oppressions of the past? To face these memories and the conditions that gave rise to them is the first and necessary step. Climate breakdown asks us to work forwards and backwards, imagining and projecting ourselves into the future under threat in order to comprehend the violence that surrounds us. Only then can we learn how best to intervene. In The Stone Gods, Jeanette Winterson writes, "Perhaps the universe is a memory of our mistakes. However, remembering is much more than an uncomfortable prompt. It is also a means of bringing to the surface practices and relations that have been overlooked by the mainstream, architectural and otherwise. The future is not a script to be written from scratch. It can be found in the gaps in the present, where new and fragile formations are already emerging that need support and understanding. The future is where these nascent possibilities can be rearranged and brought together to develop new relations, founded on a critique of the status quo in order to move intentionally away from it. The future already exists in practices dismissed as errant, in a billion fugitive creative expressions. Because the center has failed us so tragically, hope must emerge from elsewhere, in the spaces that have been forgotten, in memories that are yet to be erased. In this way, we will remember the future."
And just to finish, I think that we need to rewrite Kant. Thank you.
Can't see you all. Guys, come on, MOULD team, come on. Woo! Woo! Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you to the team. That was a really moving and beautiful sort of tour de force of where we are and also just describing your project. I'd like to next welcome to the stage Baerbel Mueller. Baerbel Mueller, as I mentioned, is from Applied Foreign Affairs, and who will be talking to us about her project, Unsealing Territories. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here at this rich opening weekend of Nature of Hope. Thank you, all of you in the first row, for having me. I will share some thoughts on the theme of this biennial and the future of architecture. Following that, I will present some background to our video installation, Soft Unsealing, which is showcased next door. We've heard about the curatorial statement of Nature of Hope and this panel, and we aim to explore some aspects of how architecture plays a role in contributing to biodiversity, local ecologies, and social connectivity. In my words, the pressing question is how to architect alternative futures and beyond. As creatives from within a not at all innocent profession, we are being asked to question its performance in the future in order to tackle the massive challenges of our time, which cry for other alternative approaches. How can spatial practices contribute to visionary, while at the same time tangible, ecological, technological, and decolonized futures, from the very local to the planetary and beyond, human-centered interests? What radically other perspectives and modi operandi do we need to invent and apply? I go briefly through some key concepts which are crucial to me in this regard. From architecture to architecting as verb. Maybe architecture as a noun alone as a given belongs in the past. We need to concentrate on and take the act of perceiving, thinking, conceptualizing, translating, and connecting more seriously.
and put more of our energy and creativity into the process, not to the product. Not for the sake of the process, but rather to loop it back into our designs. Architecting as a verb also implies that there is no ending. Unlearning. We need more experimental, speculative approaches in architecture, and we need to unlearn a lot. To come up with another body of knowledge, new approaches, other spaces, and alternative solutions, we need to engage with the unknown. This is naturally more about observing and listening than it is about stating and quickly reacting. Creating environments versus building buildings. We need to conceptualize and design inclusive environments instead of buildings. These environments evolve over time, encourage appropriation, and are constantly in the becoming. They serve as invitations to engage. Aiming to create environments will also help us move beyond the binary thinking of inside versus outside spaces, urban versus rural, as well as artificial separations between various scales and aspects of design, such as planning, architecture, and landscaping. A holistic understanding of space based on cohabitation. There has been a shift in focus from a strictly human-centered perspective to more inclusive, multi-species approaches in the architectural field, acknowledging the interconnectedness of all living beings and their habitats within the built environment. With a growing awareness of environmental challenges and the impact of human activity on ecosystems, we are increasingly considering the needs and well-beings of non-human species, designing with an ecology of the living approach. Multi-scalar. As we know by now, everything is connected with everything from micro to macro scales. Therefore, multi-scalar approaches are crucial. Urban acupuncture. There is much potential in the radiating effects of a small-scale intervention and their network capacities. Even the smallest strategic spatial interaction can have wide-reaching impacts. From managing to caring. The cultural theorist Elke Krasny, who has been quoted before, advocates for a shift in architectural practice from a focus on managing resources and spaces to a more empathetic approach that emphasizes caring for communities, environments, and relationships. This paradigm shift encourages architects to prioritize sustainability, social equity, and the well-being of all living beings over modernistic ideas of management, neoliberal interests, and patronizing attitudes. Decarbonization and decolonization on all levels. In her 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale, Leslie Locke highlighted how decarbonization and decolonization are historically intertwined. She emphasizes that true progress requires simultaneous efforts to reduce carbon footprints and dismantle colonial legacies. Now I will briefly share our Tamale Old Airfield project, which is on show next door with the video installation Soft Unsealing. When I say we, I'm referring to Applied Foreign Affairs, the lab which I founded in 2011 at the IOA at the Angewandte. I would also like to acknowledge Daniel Ziltsov, who is in the audience here, a core member of the AFA team and the artistic co-director and designer of our video installation. Since 2020, AFAR has focused on the inner urban peripheries of Tamale, the capital of Ghana's northern region. Tamale's rapid and sprawling growth has led to the merging of the built environment with the coexisting tree savanna and agricultural landscapes. Tamale is one of the fastest growing cities in West Africa, characterized by its horizontality and the presence of peripheral urban conditions embedded in the fabric of the city. Investigating these spaces through an ecological, multi-species, non-anthropocenic lens allows for new ways of understanding urban ecologies and urban change in the predominantly agricultural setting of northern Ghana. The motivation behind the project has also been to preserve these open spaces, or at least create awareness for them. In places like Accra, these are increasingly eliminated with a tabula rasa approach by investors with dramatic repercussions on the ecological and social fabric of the city. We titled the umbrella project Tamale Territories and selected the Tamale Waterworks and adjacent forest reserve as the first inner city periphery to investigate. It is the terrain of a former dam which broke in the 1980s. It has been British colonial infrastructure at first hand. 5 themes guided the initial research: ecologies, peripheries, territories, scales, and crises. With this backbone, 5 duos investigated the Tamale Waterworks, which resulted in 5 video pieces, which were later shared on site with invited guests and all the farmers and marginalized groups appropriating the terrain. In its second phase, Tamale Territories aimed to create speculative scenarios, fictions on aqua plants and plastic for and of the Tamale Waterworks and Forest Reserve and the surrounding city. An NGO developmental approach and human-centered strategies of problem solving have been exchanged for a fictional narrative approach unfolding abundance, the multitude of identified potentials, and solar punk futures. These resulted in reels on smartphone scale. While the AFA team worked on these fictions, a friend of mine showed me the Tamale Old Airfield on a Sunday, and I fell in love with this exceptional space, a 1.4 kilometer long, 40 meter wide sealed surface, a relic of asphalt, another former British colonial infrastructure, its runway from the 1920s. I started my own artistic phenomenological research focusing on the sealscape, its erosion and multi-species appropriation of the surface, which I later showed in the exhibition Tracing Emerging Ecologies at the Nuku Center in Tamale, and last November in a deeper iteration at the Chicago Architecture Biennale. Spending much time on site, I quickly learned in conversations with individuals and the local chiefs that there has been the dream of transforming the runway into a properly planned public space in the future. This motivated me to move attention from the Tamale Waterworks to the Tamale Old Airfield with Applied Foreign Affairs. So since September 2022, we've been working on a proposal for a soft transformation of the runway into a recreation space. What you see here is like drone footage we produced in the dry season and in the rainy season. We've been commissioned quickly after, or actually during that time, by the traditional authorities and the local government. Before I will guide you through some slides showing the project process, I want to briefly explain our research and design strategy. Within the AFA lab, I introduced a concept I call applied research. Applied research advocates direct engagement, requires a willingness to learn, to embrace experimental and transdisciplinary approaches, and not to shy away from very time-consuming and labor-intense procedures in the field or out there in the city. This can manifest through sound recordings taken over a longer period of time to capture certain rhythms of life of a Muslim community or migrating birds, for example. Actually, this was a research by a student becoming a goat for a day. And the process can start fluidly from a derive technique or a clear definition of a topical interest and a medium of expression, and can culminate in public events to further engage with the community. Thereby, the process of relating and making happens in a reactive and slowed down manner, embracing conditions of uncertainty and fragility. We also went to the archives in Tamale and found interesting material of like that already back in the 1920s, farmers were negotiating about trees. We investigated the sealscape, also a product from British colonial powers in the 1920s, in detail. This is a scan of it, which you will also see outside as part of soft unsealing. And then we jumped on urban scale, so it's this constant shift between these scales, identifying project zones with allocated spaces for recreational, cultural, and economic activities with a programmatic focus for each, to later be further appropriated more informally. I think I don't have the time to go through these now, but rather focus here is some visuals where you see the market zone in the foreground, which was like also in conversation with the community, turned out to be an important aspect of the project. In the back, you see a staging ground. And this is the zone we are currently focusing on, which we title Communal Runway. And so the idea is to keep the topography and this exceptional characteristic of this sealed surface, but unseal it through the transplantation of big trees and creating seating areas and shaded places without any architectural measures, but by terraforming and transplanting of trees. And here you see again like how we do applied research. That was the very starting point, which also generated somehow the formal manifestation or translation of the design of this communal runway zone, where we looked into the potholes on site to take these as potential starting points for the planting initiatives. Here again, applied research in testing plants on site. Also shadow studies in one-to-one with some youth of the community involved. And here producing these podiums to simulate market situations. These you will also find experts of interviews with our partners, so to say clients and collaborators. So to the left, Chief Washina is our direct client, so to say, in the neighborhood. In the center, Elizabeth, she's a water engineer working at the University for Development Studies in Tamale. And to the right, Stephen, a city planner, as we are now commissioned by the city of Tamale. Here again, you see the zoning, and as I mentioned, we focus on the green zone. This is a picture from further north in Ghana. So it was already 12 years ago that we were commissioned, or I was commissioned back then, to work on a master plan for a village in a farming community, and decided that the planting of a green belt in the heart of the village is much more relevant in an environment where deforestation and climate change has crucial impact on the climate condition. This is quite interesting to talk about here. So this is the Dutch nursery Eben in Kok. So we've been there. So it seems like that this nursery is providing plants for all kinds of landscaping projects all over Europe. And so we visited Eben and learned about the transplanting of bigger trees, and will bring this technique back to Tamale. Here you see the latest construction plans, where it's all about these trees, the terraforming, and also the collection of rainwater, which is crucial. Again, one-to-one outlinings, which I'm a big fan of, because I think that is really a medium to really talk to community members who are not capable of reading plans. And that is also then with a young landscape designer from Accra in the team. We investigated potential trees for transplantation. Also, team members scanned trees in the city and in the surrounding tree savanna. And that was also now recently in February doing some prototyping on one-to-one. So this topographical design element is meant to be made from second-hand tires, and the surface to resemble like what the surface of the runway looks like now. And I think I leave it here, and I would like to read out a quote which so I was asked actually 9 years ago, in 2015, how I imagine impact design education would look like in 2025. And my response was like, in 2025, we finally will have understood that our planet has limited resources, that its ecology will collapse if we don't change. Designers will create in this spirit. They will work and act and educate simultaneously with a truly planetary and truly local approach, and in truly transcultural and truly transdisciplinary settings. It will all be about eco, not ego, about beauty, about sharing, about vision and expertise. I think it's very beautiful that now 9 years later, this biennial is very close to this vision or aim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Baerbel. I think I'll move on to our final speaker, Pedro. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for those beautiful lectures and this inspiring event. Thank you for everyone for being here. My name is Pedro Aparicio. I am an architect based in Bogota, and I have an office called APLO, where I work with a very talented group of people: Danielle, Emily, Ana, Camila, Angela, Valentina, Maria Paula. APLO is an acronym for Aligning Planets, Lines, and Orbits. This is an acronym in constant change, and I like to think that architecture and design today are perhaps more about designing time than designing in space. We know that planetary alignment occurs based on the time each planet takes to complete one orbit around the sun, and the duration for each orbit differs from planet to planet, which explains why these events are rare. But once they happen, I like to think that they are in good company, that planets feel accompanied, and that they feel companionship. And this is something that I want to talk to you about today, and that is the idea of accompanying, the idea of being present. As part of our projects, we're currently present in the Colombia North Pacific coast, where we are learning different ways of doing architecture. And in the Gulf of Tribugá, we're being accompanied by 2 long processes of leadership, one called Corporación Mano Cambiada, led by Josefina Klinger. Mano Cambiada is an organization creating models of self-development and autonomous pedagogies. Mano Cambiada itself is the name for an economic practice that was replaced with the introduction of paper money, an economic medium based on the exchange of know-hows, and that's part of what Corporación Mano Cambiada is trying to do, bring back that way of exchanging. And the other one is the fishing artisanal group, Tiburones de Coquí, led by friend Smith Valencia. And Tiburones are a group of fishermen exploring ways of traditional and contemporary fishing techniques and mangrove caretaking. They take their name from the hammerhead shark and how they are born within the mangrove. I'd also like to thank the curatorial team and the efforts by Saskia, Jana, Lina, and everyone here to understand and interpret the way that we work in APLO. When we were invited, we mentioned that our processes are live and that we're not necessarily interested in exhibiting retrospective notion of our work, but rather to present ways of moving the project forward. So everything that you will see in the exhibition has been a new instance, and that's kind of the way that we finance part of these projects, is through events like this, or the Canadian Centre for Architecture that has funded the project, recently the Graham Foundation grant. So I will be showing some fragments of these new instances that were done for this exhibition, which summarize to 3 short films and the submerging of a mangrove tree in the ocean. And they will be looping in their own rhythm, and I will be speaking. Sometimes words and images will not come together, sometimes they will. and hopefully by the end of this 15 minutes, they will show some sort of alignment. So what does it mean to design to the beat of currents and tides? It's a question that has been posed to my practice by the Pacific Ocean and the interpreters of these waters. And what we've been said many times is that countries measure their knowledge by the alphabetization rates, and the reduction of that means a success of making knowledge. And we've been told that analphabetism are those that cannot read or write the spoken word. I like to think that this is a very challenging notion, because there are people that read and write other languages beyond human language. There are people that read and write the language of the forest, of the trees, of the winds, waves, currents, the language of fish. And today we need more of those polyglots to really conceive a relationship with everything that's alive. The leadership processes in the Gulf of Triugas, says Josefina, are also like the tides. When the tides are high, you see things that become chaotic. You cannot go out of the river. What's going on? There's a difficulty to understand the movement or the passage from one place to the other. Nonetheless, when the tide is low, it reveals the bottom. It reveals what's going on. And there's a saying from the elders that when the tide is low, it decorates. Tide oscillates every 6 hours, and new beaches are being transformed constantly in the Pacific Ocean. And from this movement, from this sensitivity, is where Josefina is proposing models of self-development based in oceanic time. One of them is connected to an expanded notion of migration. The deep waters of this Gulf make it a very special place for the migration of species, humpback whales, turtles, birds, yellowtail tuna, and others, sardines. But at the same time, this place has been narrated as a peripheral place with no opportunities. There's a constant migration also of knowledge, of scientific data being extracted, and there's migration of local talent that seeks out opportunities elsewhere. So there's a question for an up-and-coming need to design the strategies for a generational relief, for the new generation that's going to inherit the model of environmental governance that has allowed for the marine and riverine ecologies to be prosperous. Josefina has employed one strategy called the Migration Festival, which is basically a strategy to unpack most of new scientific knowledge that is produced every year in the Gulf and to create pedagogical forms for kids and youth to engage with this and other forms of knowing. Local forms of knowing in the key of music, performance, and play. A form of non-violent activism through the making of costumes and the making of theater. There's an embodied work where kids become turtles, where kids become whales, where kids become birds, waves, tides. We plan to establish VMV Pacific Biocultural Center to commemorate the 30th anniversary of Law 70 of 1993, which historically granted collective land titles to Afro-Pacific communities. The center aims to safeguard the traditional knowledge and ecosystems of Colombia's Triugas Gulf, which was recently designated a hope spot due to a significant contribution to planetary ocean health, and most recently part of the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. VMV is a word in the Chocó jargon that means look again, hear and listen, pay attention, and it will be built in Nuquí. It's a small town in the Pacific Ocean that acts as Triugas' political, logistical, and educational center. Nuquí is a lab for community-based environmental governance where Embera indigenous reserves, Afro-collective territories, the Utria National Park, and exclusive zones for artisanal fishing converged to manage 230,000 hectares of communal land of the world's most threatened ecosystems, mangroves, coral reefs, rainforest. Nonetheless, drug trafficking, foreign interests in developing a deep-water port pose a challenge for the region's future. In VMV, we've been asking how can architecture strengthen transgenerational, multi-ethnic, multicultural ties as means for Black and Indigenous identity? How can we foster digital technologies that embody practices like botany, gastronomy, dance, music, and theater to equip children and youth with practical tools that support their agency as guardians of the territory and biodiversity that they're inheriting from their elders, and give a roof for biocultural organizations to become sustainable? VMV opens completely towards Nuquí's public park. It's a strategic place surrounded by sport, educational, touristic, and religious spaces, and the site is charged with collective memory, as it once housed a telecom broadcasting station providing telegraph and telephone and internet connections to the world, a place that in the 2000s, which was a public company, was bought by the Spanish conglomerate Telefónica, and soon enough, due to the mobile telephone economy, it was abandoned. Similar conditions happened throughout Colombia, where you have telecom stations all the way from the Caribbean deserts in the north to the rivers of the Amazon basin. And Josefina managed to grant access from Telefónica to the abandoned building. And now the space is being programmed in different moments through iterative versions of what has been called the migration school, which is architecture scale 1:1, where we have crafted the design for this place. So the consensus of what this building should have or do is to reactivate the possibility of public emissions and receptions of messages within and outside the territory through cyclical loops that on one hand create digital content and on the other provide science, governance, and media incubation programs to train the next generation with tools to preserve biodiversity. This is also an extracurricular space for learning that moves outside of the public pedagogical instances that have their own works around power. And finally, Van Wee materializes the evolution of the Pacific Migration Festival to transition from an event-based strategy to one that is a continuous pedagogical infrastructure. So this project is always in the loop for new allies, so always feel free to reach out. The second project that is also showcased here is called Payao. It is an underwater and marine coastal intervention that's based on the understanding of migratory logics of fish and mollusks in the Pacific Ocean, and it installs a submerged garden that will act as a cultivation for species. It is a mangrove that at the end of its life is towed by a boat, and for brief moments it creates a floating floor of tides and tensions and then is sunk by the weight of the rocks tied to the trunk. So through the necessity of recharging an existing anchored fishing aggregation device, the community fishing group Los Tiburones de Coquí have iteratively designed new and corresponding forms for both submarine and surface life. Payao is actually an old fishing technology widely used in the Philippines that made its way to the Colombian Pacific around 10 years ago, apparently through a YouTube video. Fishing aggregation devices have a long history in Southeast Asia, and extensive research exists about the political ecologies they create. However, these current investigations around their presence in the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor suggests a research priority in relation to their potential effect on biological connectivity between Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica. This technology invites architecture to think of underwater design as ocean stewardship and community space making, and presents a case for situated architecture practice and body pedagogies, or forms of teaching and learning from the knowledge of the body. Payao techniques uses a fallen or soon-to-fall mangrove tree to create fish shelters in the ocean about 1,000 meters from the shore. And once the tree is in the river, the rafts that are tied underneath it take it out and float. When the tide is high, several motorboats pull the mangrove until it reaches the sea. And then, like a floating garden, it is submerged. So there are close ties between the Payao and the mangrove ecosystem that have been crafted by some of the members of the Tiburones de Coquí. And in addition to a sustained mangrove reforestation process, the Payao receives 1 tree a year in order to maintain its lushness as a marine garden. So it is not necessarily an artificial reef because it's temporary and it decomposes. But there's a cyclical relationship of care between the mangrove, the fishermen, and a question for changing the existing Payao strategy to one where mangrove trees are eventually replaced by artificial structures and become phantom Payaos that are not marked with a buoy, but will be marked with GPS coordinates and will not be used for fishing. So there's a dialogue around the use of driftwood, iron rebars, alternative materials that open to new imaginations in regard to the space created by this technology and how it can benefit fish with a temporary home, And how can architecture contribute to the scientific and community-based call for a turn from fishing aggregating devices to fish enhancing devices? And what materials and geometries better serve the living habits of fish? Where can people meet in the ocean? And how embodied knowledge of traditional fishermen informs the architectural design process? What does it mean to design again to the beats of migration, currents and tides? And these are parts of the questions that Josefina from Mano Cambiada and Smith from Los Tiburones de Coquí are presenting in this Biennale, and presenting to the discipline itself, and by doing so, accompanying us to redefine architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. If Jeremy, Pedro, Baerbel, would you like to join me here? No. I think there's one. There's one here. Oh, okay. Thank you. I have to say, I think it's a sort of beautiful triptych, I would say, in the ways that sort of Jeremy, you introduced us to this kind of landscape of the possible, or recognizing the way things are, mapping it out, and then sort of reflecting back on where there are maybe opportunities through that. And Baerbel, it's sort of really interesting to see how you're sort of in your context there trying to kind of negotiate a context that's very sort of rapidly changing, but is also sort of a desire for some kind of a different way forward. And Pedro, I really thought that your projects were really beautifully tied into sort of like other ways of like knowledge, but also other ways of like acknowledging time, and sort of articulating how we can actually use those as points of reference when it comes to designing, but also thinking about how we facilitate change for communities. With that in mind, one thing I thought that I felt was quite pertinent across all three of your projects, and even in the exhibition, there's a question of language. And I think each of you was thinking about language, or the ways in which we change how we use language, to be able to kind of begin to articulate this change that's required. I was wondering if I can get your reflections on how each of you in your own practices, have been thinking about the kind of language that we need to move towards. And maybe Jeremy, if you could kick us off with that. I think that your sort of stratification, let's say, of the diagram and the ways in which you've sort of separated that diagram out is a starting point. But I just wonder what your perception of that on the way you want to practice is.
Well, I think we've been really careful and endlessly precise in trying to get the words right. So the complexity of that diagram is not random. It was through endless discussions and using mirror and stuff to try to get the words. I completely agree that actually thinking through words like that as a way of kind of describing a world is incredibly important. And so once one's done the sort of the language of despair or the language of modernity, then I think you're right to ask what's the next set of languages which don't over-determine, over-technical, make things too technical, but also the main thing is about exclusion. So how does one get a language, and I'll hand over to Baerbel here, about how do you get a language which allows everybody to tell stories within? How does one get a language which is shared so that the expert doesn't come along and use expert words which are meaningless? So I think you're right to say that actually the reinvention and the kind of the care of future words is really important, and it'd be really interesting to hear from Pedro and Baerbel about how in their discussions with as it were, I hate to call them non-experts, but that's how they're defined. Yeah. How with the people with the people with the community who are going to be there, how you get that across.
I think our strategy has a lot to do with like translating on all levels, and it's in the work itself, but it's also manifest in this piece out there that translating. I mean, we have like this 9-channel video presentation there, and the concept behind is like that we only have fragmentary knowledge always, and we only have fragmentary insights, and but also like all these lenses play into each other. So it's also like that we are in a time where we understood that everything is beyond linear. And on top of that, as I'm working in this West African context, there's also this additional difficulty to do this translation to a European context where there is all these cliché narratives on poverty, etc., which I don't want to replicate.
Yeah.
Maybe I leave it here.
Yeah, I think that the question of language is quite good. Because there's a limit to words and a need to kind of expand to different modes of communication. And I think that the practices of the Pacific Ocean can unpack a set of poetics where language becomes not necessarily something limited to the words you carry in a book underneath your arm, which many times from the disciplinary perspective or is like the ultimate consignation of knowledge. But actually you dispose yourself from that written language, and knowledge is carried through the body and exercised constantly. And something that I find fascinating is the constant creation of new languages through a very precise seek for communication with the live media, which can be, you know, the strategy that Josefina poses of the Festival of the Migration, becoming fish, becoming whale, becoming turtle. But then also how the elder fisherman group can translate the condition of fish and create shelters. I think that poses questions directly to a discipline that has built itself in a human language, human-centered language, and is, you know, in need of understanding or translating other ways of communicating. And the interpreters are not necessarily within academia, are not necessarily within the discipline itself.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one thing that kind of I think is quite interesting is also Baerbel and Pedro, in your work. You've kind of touched on it already. There's this need to recognize other knowledges, right? To be able to say, okay, well, my training is, you know, from a specific standpoint, let's say, and it carries with it that sort of upstream, some of that upstream thinking that may have informed. And well, it actually has informed us to where we are today. And I wonder how the two of you specifically negotiate that sort of tension between seeing the other knowledges, but then also being able to integrate that into your work, or even completely hand over to those kind of other knowledges as well. I know, Pedro, you mentioned that in the context that you were working with the fishermen, were looking at YouTube videos in order to be. So, like, how do you, as an architect, like, situate yourself in that situation where, like, do they even need an architect in that kind of situation? Not to, like, take it that way.
No, definitely not. It's obsolete.
Yeah.
I think that there's a question there around, like, deep hanging, just like being there. Actually, the predecessor of this project with the fishermen was a community restaurant funded by a chef and their foundation after she won an award in the Basque Culinary Prize Award, and gave 150,000 euros to the community to build a restaurant. So there was a call for architects because the price required that all the drawings were technically signed. And that generated spaces for deep hanging and just being. And amid those spaces is where I learned about these new techniques that were happening. So I found that it would be interesting to, I mean, I saw it as contemporary landscape architecture, and said like, okay, if we draw this in 2 sections, we can just pose these to prices and start circulating this project so that it brings in resources to generate different things. So part of that is, I think that a work there as an architect is more about circulating these events within a disciplinary environment that kind of gives us example to push the boundary forward and think of other ways that space and time are being designed.
I think in the Ghanaian context, this is a really complex topic. One example I can give is like that I have been interested in the idea of trees for a long time, in especially the village. I've been living in and working for long, and that there is all these ideas of like trees being spirits and being connected to each other, and like up until recently in the Western context, this was considered ridiculous, esoteric, whatever. And now we have the scientific proof that trees communicate with each other, etc. So. But there has been a colonial history in Ghana, same as in so many other non-Western societies or like parts of this planet. And so there is also religions came in, etc. So there is also not really the trust in the local knowledge in many instances, like in this neighborhood, like where the Tamale Old Airfield is embedded in. Of course, the local chiefs would like to see massive built structures and not the transplanting of trees. Yeah, I leave it.
But just to pick, I think it's a really important question. There's a quote I always use from the late philosopher Gillian Rose, where she's talking about kind of radical community architecture, where architects were just basically there to hold a pencil and do nothing else because, you know, power is knowledge and knowledge is power, and get rid of all that. And her quote is that the architect was demoted, but the people did not rise to power. I.e. that by divesting all forms of knowledge, then you're in a lose-lose. You throw the baby out with the bathwater. So one needs different forms of knowledge and shared knowledges, and a knowledge of which has a kind of ethical and a relational sensibility to it. But I do think, I have to say this because I'm an educator, I do think there are particular, as Pedro has talked about, and Baerbel, beautiful work, roles which spatial agents can play in a collaborative manner. We should not lose sight of that. That's really important, so we don't divest ourselves of everything.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important point to make, actually. I think there's a lot of work around finding the middle ground between, obviously, you know, facilitating and but also still providing some kind of means or sort of infrastructure. And I think, to me, I think what I find fascinating about all your work is the ways in which you create linkages between either different locations, different bodies of different kind of connections, or even different sort of ecologies. I think that's really that's sort of something that we also talk about in the exhibition quite extensively. I guess the question I want to ask Jeremy, I'm sort of thinking about your metaphor that you're talking about, where we're standing in the river and we're looking upstream and we're looking and that what's happening upstream is also sort of affecting what's happening downstream. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about this kind of like this idea of this vision of this kind of river and how that came about.
I think it came really late, and it was just a means of. I think actually it came because I think Jano asked for something which tried to describe the different sides of what we're doing. And I think that it kind of just crystallized this idea of you have to look upstream. You only make changes by transforming the systems of violence which have led us to where we are. and therefore one has to. But at the same time, you can't just remain up there. I think it's very easy as a comfortable academic for me or Tatiana or Anthony or all of us to kind of just look endlessly upstream and kind of be annoying critical Marxists and that's kind of it. So that one also needs, particularly as educators, to look downstream in order that one has hope. And I think that the key thing which all of this Biennale does for me, or that we're all talking about, is that if the systemic change which is required is going to be accompanied by social change, that social change is also a spatial change. So there is activity for spatial agents to engage with. So I think the kind of that is really important.
No, I definitely agree. I think it takes a need to be able to look wider than just the practice itself.
Yeah.
And I think, again, all the projects in the exhibition, if you haven't been already, it's right next door, do really well. So I want to also point out something that I felt was consistent across the ways the three of you also talked about your work, is that you each deal with time in a very interesting way. I think, Pedro, you talk about time as if, from my read of it, it's like nature dictates the time scales that you work to. Like you're talking about like how the local wildlife or ecology or things actually articulate the ways in which you make decisions around your architecture. Baerbel, you're dealing with sort of like the past and then sort of like the present and the future. And Jeremy, obviously, you're talking about this kind of like this where we are and where we're going to next. But I just wonder if that's, obviously I think to a certain degree it is intentional, but how deeply is it rooted in your practice, in the way that you think about your practice? Yeah.
I think we, as architects, or how students of architecture are still educated, we are a bit arrogant in believing that we are very trained to enter a certain context, read it in half a day, and then we start projecting. So I really insist on this unlearning, and also spending endless time on site, and as I mentioned, becoming a goat for a day. And this is also really difficult for many students of architecture. And I think artists are much better in looking carefully before there is any attempts to translate that into something. And as architecture is also something different than art, that we have a kind of service, how should I say? So it's also a service practice, and therefore we need to come up with solutions. But I think it's really crucial to change the entire practice in how we enter a certain context.
Yeah. Pedro?
I will complement that because a lot of times, our media is mostly space-based. And at least in Colombia, when you graduate architecture school, you have the legal capacity of signing documents. And those documents are space-based. So there is a tricky question there of how you transition, right, from, let's say, a mandate that has been constituted within society, that architects conceive space legally, right? And a need to go beyond that, to find new media that allows us to inquire space, to feel space, and to project in space, right? And in time, I'm sorry. And I think that in my own case, the Pacific Ocean and their interpreters have very, very precise ways of understanding time. And there is where I think that there's a fertile ground globally to conceive relationships with these interpreters. For example, when a boat is going out a river in high tide and the ocean is coming in strong, there's a moment with a precise word that's called safio. I don't know what's the word in English, but a boat driver in the Chocó region will call it safio, which is almost like a 1.5-minute period between waves, which is where you can take an advantage and go out. So a lot of leaders in this region talk about safio, and it's about reading, the social dynamics. And when you identify a safio, you can kind of project yourself and go in, right, to generate some sort of change. So these poetics actually or everyday life exchanges with time-based media, I think that require urgent translation and just like very special ways of informing the way that we think of architecture.
But Pedro said it. I mean, he said, you know, as architects, we should engage first with time and not with space. And all your work appeared to be about that, the instantaneous kind of nature of a festival versus the rhythm of the tide versus the long thing of a planetary systems. It's all there. And, you know, the history of architecture is told as the history of space and the manipulation of space. And that's getting now really dangerous, so that, you know, blimey, we can fold space, we can blob space, we can mid-journey space. I mean, it's like we are these kind of masters of space with all these words about it. But, you know, it's a hopeless activity, because in the end, space is nothing which can be seen simply as a formal structure. It's clearly a social structure, and as soon as it's a social structure, it's also a temporal structure. But the trouble is with time is that it's bloody difficult, because it's uncontrollable. And so what architects try to do is control it by the snapshot of the photograph, by freezing it. Or if you look at, I guess that every single review of a Peter Zumthor building uses the word timeless, yeah? As it were. So that this kind of sense that we are above it.
Yeah.
And to sort of be vulnerable to time is incredibly important in order that we get away from that kind of sense we either control it or else we just deal with space.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredibly humbling, because it also reminds us of how much of a blip we are on the radar. Yeah. But before that gets any darker, I think maybe the last question I'd like to ask the three of you, and this one is, I think, pertinent with the title. How do each of you think hope presents itself in your work? But then also, how do you think it's going to? What would you say to inspire hope in the practitioners here, but also others? Maybe you, Jeremy, would you like to start?
Well, hope in the work that MOULD did, I think, is in the gaps in the present. That if we put together 120 practices, there's another 83 here. If you actually then think, okay, the hope is that you can leverage those, and that you shouldn't be kind of told that in doing this sort of slightly maverick work that it is maverick or marginal. We need to have, the hope lies in the reimagining of futures which are possible. So that's where the hope lies. And the hope lies for me, as you know, I say it again. I said to St. Martin's, if I didn't have hope for the next generation, I shouldn't have been head of St. Martin's. I should have just walked away. So the hope lies within the next generation, and us old guys should kind of shuffle off into the future and let them take over. As I think, you know, that's why it's so fantastic that what the four curators there said, you know, the idea of activism, the idea of relational stuff, of systemic change, and so on, is so important.
Yeah. Baerbel?
Where to start from? I think maybe also there is the need to be humble in the sense like that small changes have rippling effects, and if at the end we don't end up changing this sealed surface, then at least we have like worked with 50 kids or talked to women selling their products. And so I think there is we all shouldn't underestimate like the impact of small gestures. That's where I think hope lies.
Yeah. Pedro?
I'll replicate some of that. Also, I mean, hope is a feeling that you carry with you, dance, you move through it. And being hopeful, I think, is about accompanying, about companionship, because it can be exhausting also. Sometimes you see, you know, everything can be so hopeless. But hope, in a way, you know, when these alignments occur, there's something about that companionship that gives power to a projective capacity that, you know, things can be transformed, things can be seen differently. It's about actually unlearning, and there's something interesting about like systemic unlearning, which is intervention directly on the structures, let's say, of power, for example. And how everything has an unexpected spin. For example, part of the work that we've been doing with Josefina, we were very focused in, okay, we need Telefónica to donate the land. But it is like in the middle of a very bureaucratical process. They are not even able to sell it for 1 penny. It's too bureaucratical, but it's abandoned. But by moving and drawing and animating, and we managed to circulate this all the way to the Ministry of Culture in Colombia. And now Josefina and I are contractors for the Ministry of Culture. And together we're leading a task team to design cultural houses for the whole region. So VMV becomes a prototype, the blueprint of something that will become public policy. And I think, you know, those unexpected turns that happen eventually, you know, keep hope alive. But the project is recognizing that it is not what you expected. It will always turn in a different way.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Jeremy, Baerbel, and Pedro for your wonderful, wonderful presentations today. Just a round of applause.
Please give it up one more time.
Over to you.
Thank you, Hani. That wraps up the first part. Very insightful, very dense. I'm honored to have you here, and of course all other contributors and practitioners. We will now have a half an hour break, and then there's a second session for those who are up for it, where Emmanuel Pratt, he is one of the driving forces of the Sweetwater Foundation, will speak through the collaboration or the things we mutually share, and maybe some other insights are brought to the table by people that have made installations for the Rotterdam Architecture Month. So this is a bit more, let's say, tying the finishing moment of the Rotterdam Architecture Month. There's DAF will be there, there's Super U Studio. But I would say, without further ado, let's get some fresh air, have a peek in the exhibition. For those of you who don't know, there's a lovely terrace, have a coffee, and see you back in half an hour.
Thanks, Hani. Lovely questions.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too much.